Our speaker tonight is the author of Why God Makes Sense in a World That Doesn't, which is also the topic for tonight's presentation. Gavin Ortlund serves as the senior pastor of First Baptist Church of Ojai in Ojai, California. He holds a PhD in historical theology from Fuller Theological Seminary and MDiv from Covenant Theological Seminary and a BA in philosophy and religion from the University of Georgia. He's the author of several other books, including Theological Retrieval for Evangelicals, Why We Need Our Past to Have a Future, Anselm's Pursuit of Joy, an interpretation of the Proslogion, and Retrieving Augustine's Doctrine of Creation, Ancient Wisdom for Current Controversy. He's also a popular blogger, and he writes regularly for sites like the Gospel Coalition and Desiring God, as well as his personal blog, Soliloquium. Gavin is an ordained minister in the Conservative Congregational Christian Conference, and he served for 6 years on staff at Sierra Madre Congregational Church, where he met and became friends with Hugh Ross. Gavin has a passion for making the Christian faith clear and compelling for all different kinds of people. I'm now going to stop sharing my screen and give the platform to Gavin. Gavin, it's all yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kirby, and hope that you all can hear me okay and hopefully see me too. Yeah, I feel really honored to be with you all. I love Reasons to Believe. Honored to be friends with Hugh Ross and many of the other folks at Reasons to Believe, and I'm so thankful for that ministry and just the wonderful work for God's kingdom that they're all doing. So let me say a few words about what I was thinking we could do in terms of the plan of attack tonight. I don't know about you all, but if a speaker sort of just goes on and on and on, I tend to find it more interesting to have points for interaction. So I will we'll have lots of time for Q&A at the end, and I can stay for a bit to answer questions and to interact a bit. And I'm even happy if at some point during, if we need a pause to clarify something that, as far as I'm concerned, that's fine with me. But let me just introduce myself a tiny bit more in terms of this book and in terms of this topic and a little bit of my heart, my passion for it. Then what we'll do is I'm going to take a few moments. I'll have sort of two halves for my presentation. The first half will be about a particular way of thinking about doing apologetics right now. And then the second half will be putting it into practice by considering different arguments that we can use with our non-Christian friends and relatives and neighbors and co-workers and so forth. Let me say why I'm passionate about this topic. My academic training is not in apologetics, but it has become one of the great passions of my life. I started a YouTube channel 2 years ago called Truth Unites, on which I do basically two things. One is I give what I hope is an ironic and gracious defense of Protestantism. I have many friends who've left the Protestant tradition to become Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox or something like this, and I'm trying to stake out where we agree with those traditions, but also give reasons why one might be a Protestant. And I find that's a conversation that needs to be had right now. The other passion that has really taken over my imagination and my heart is apologetics. That's the great interest of this book that I have written that Kirby just mentioned. And there are three reasons why I've become so interested in that. One is that I've been through 2 seasons of angst in my own life about my faith. I use that word angst to describe that. It was just this sense of this churning curiosity and worry and kind of chasing down questions. And I think many thoughtful Christians know what that feels like. Another is that I've had many friends who have deconstructed their faith. There's a lot of talk of deconstruction as a movement right now. And unfortunately, for many people, deconstruction means a wholesale stripping away of even faith in God or faith in Christ. And in many cases, it's been friends I didn't expect. And I've listened very carefully to them to try to understand their feelings and their perspective. And I've realized, whoa, we've got something we've got to grapple with here. One of the last things I ever want to do is be dismissive toward others or act as though, oh yeah, I don't really need to listen. You know, it's like, no, there's particular doubts and worries that are causing this that we need to listen to understand and respond well. And that's partly how I've cast the book. And the third is I'm just aware that there's a lot of polarization in our culture and a lot of outrage. There's also a lot of disenchantment with the church. Many people have experienced a wounding because of a fallen minister or Christian leader or some other abuse issue or something that has happened in the church that has caused their view of the church to be reduced in one way or another. I think all of that swirls together in the climate right now to encourage the need for apologetics, but also maybe a slightly different angle of approach for some. And I'm thinking especially of the younger generation, even down into like high school students and college students right now, which, you know, it's amazing how fast the years go by. And already I feel pretty distant from that age group. This month I turned 39. So I know that may seem pretty young, but I'm also pretty different in my instincts from someone who's 20 years younger than me. And so it's interesting to listen to people and try to give a good response. And that's of course our mandate, 1 Peter 3:15, gentleness and respect in giving a reason for our faith. So what I'd like to do first off is share 3 different qualities of an approach to apologetics that's just flavored a little differently. And I want to emphasize that this is not a qualitative difference. It's not like apologetics has been being done in one way, and now we need to completely jump off of that lily pad onto a different lily pad, okay? It's more like we've been facing this direction and we're doing the same thing, but maybe just a slightly different accent to it or a slightly different touch to it. And I'm not in any way suggesting this is what everyone must do, but this is just me sharing what I have found useful for myself and in conversations with my friends, especially younger people. And that is to pursue an apologetic that is sensitive to 3 things: beauty, narrative, and abductive reasoning. And I'll just explain each of these and why I think these can qualify the way we do apologetics right now in ways that may be helpful and may help us gain a hearing with people. So first, beauty. Blaise Pascal is the figure who influenced this book more than any other. I spent a lot of time reading through his famous Pensées, or thoughts, the sort of collection of scattered thoughts that he had found posthumously and published that are so pithy and interesting. And one of the ones that stood out to me the most is he's basically, I quote this at the start of the book, he's basically saying that people hate religion and are afraid that it might be true. Now that already is so insightful, isn't it? What he means by religion is he's thinking of the Christian religion, and he's sort of, it shows a psychological sensitivity to the dynamics of human interaction. You know, if all you do is just bludgeon people with argument and ratchet up the reasoning as tightly as you can, that may not actually reach real people, because so often the cause of the resistance isn't rational or mainly rational. So often it's a more deep-seated resistance that can be sometimes touched by beauty. That's what Pascal says. He says the cure for this is to help people see that they should want the gospel to be true. Now, that's a bit tricky in how we might flesh that out, because there is, we don't want to downplay the reality of sin and rebellion against God. But at the same time, I do believe the gospel is good news, and it will be experienced as a happy message to those who open their heart up to it, to respond to it. So a lot of what I'm trying to do in the book is try to enchant the reader. And a lot of what I think our apologetics should do is not merely touch the brain, but touch the heart and the imagination and the will. We should be seeking to help people be caught up into a transcendent vision of what reality is really like. The way I put it in the book is like this: if you believe in naturalism, that is the philosophy that there's nothing beyond physical nature, and you transition from that to saying, well, maybe Jesus did rise from the dead, and now you're considering that, you're looking down the road, you're open to this possibility, the movement from naturalism to the possibility of Easter should feel to people like a movement from confinement and darkness and despair and barrenness unto the flowers, the sun shining, joy beyond your wildest dreams. Because if you just think about the implications of both possibilities, all it takes is 10 seconds of thought. And this is what I'm doing, relentlessly trying to do throughout the book, is on naturalism, nothing ultimately matters. If you just think about it, every human being and every memory or consequence of every human being ultimately will equal out to nothing significant. It will not be remembered. On Christian theism, if Jesus rose from the dead, every single millisecond of our lives is flooded with meaning. Every decision we make will reverberate into eternity. And there's the possibility of infinite, everlasting joy that not only ends the suffering of this world, but it turns it into good. And I'll say more about that in a moment. But to make that appeal is to touch the heart. It's to appeal to beauty. And this is, I want to clarify, this is not an either or. I am not saying we should appeal to beauty rather than truth. I do believe it is helpful to appeal to beauty and truth, a both and. And this is, as I've discovered in my research, from a theological standpoint, a classical Christian way of going about apologetics. And I've engaged with theologians like the Roman Catholic theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar, who is perhaps the greatest theologian of beauty in all of church history. He developed more than anyone theological aesthetics, which means thinking about beauty from a specifically theological angle. And he's drawing a lot from the classical values of the true, the good, and the beautiful. And this is a classic way of arguing for the gospel, commending it as all three, and seeing that all three are interrelated. We need to help our non-Christian friends, family members, and coworkers come to be impressed with the truthfulness of the gospel, but we also need them to see its goodness and beauty. I believe with all of my heart that apologetic is best suited for the needs of the times right now. Let me just say three particular characteristics of our culture that I believe make that apologetic most meaningful. Number one, we live in a time of disenchantment. Many people have lost a sense of the transcendent. Many people have lost a sense of the vertical. Many people feel a kind of quiet despair that life is not ultimately, I think especially right now, I would even say by my lights, to the best of my ability to tell, more so now than maybe 10 years ago. And I just believe that that beauty is one way to puncture that sense of disenchantment. This is why many secular people don't believe in a Christian metaphysic, but they still enjoy Christian music. Maybe not what you'd find on the radio as Christian music, but they still enjoy the music of classical music, for example, that can convoke this sense of the transcendent. And I talk a lot about this. I make an argument for music in the book. But another example would be the arts. Literature, for example. I have known so many people who have become open to the gospel by reading Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Now, why would that be? It's just a story. It's just fiction, right? Well, within that story is a kind of transcendent beauty that reflects a Christian metaphysic. Tolkien couldn't help but write in a way that would be alluring and enchanting to people because he was a Christian. He believed, and there's a kind of Christian metaphysics to the Lord of the Rings. There's angels, for example. Angels are all over the place. They're not called angels, but I believe that this is one way of breaking down the nihilism and despair of people around us. There's a way to summon up the imaginations of our non-Christian friends and say, what if there's more? What if there's more? A second characteristic of our culture that calls for beauty as well as truth is the sense of distraction. In many ways, our greatest opponent as apologists is not sharp counter arguments. It's apathy. It's people are on their phones so much, they're not even thinking about it. People are, and Pascal talks about this so much as well, his famous statement that He believes the sole cause of man's unhappiness is not knowing how to stay quietly in a room. And I used to think that this was just a kind of overstatement for rhetorical value. But if you read him in context, what he's saying is, if we weren't distracted, if we could stay quietly in a room, we'd have to deal with what's really going on inside of us. We'd have to deal with our fear of the afterlife. We'd have to deal with our deep perennial unhappiness. We'd have to deal with what's going on, but we fill our lives with distractions to avoid these ultimate questions. That's what Pascal is arguing. Well, I believe there's a lot to that in our age, particularly because of these crazy devices that we're all carrying around with us that are always pulling our consciousness away. And so I believe beauty can particularly help us speak into the distracted. It kind of, Peter Kreeft calls beauty the prophet of goodness, as he's speaking about the three transcendentals. Beauty, he says, goes before truth and goodness, calling out, here comes truth, here comes goodness. And I believe there's something to that. There's value in beauty. It kind of cuts through the distraction and arrests the attention. There's lots of people in our culture who don't believe in the transcendent notionally, but when they hear a glorious strain of classical music, they might pause and say, wait a second, maybe there is something to it. And aesthetic arguments like that are the arguments I've heard most frequently conceded by atheists as having some value. I've heard atheists more frequently say, I don't believe in God, but when I listen to Beethoven, sometimes I wonder. More frequently than I've heard them say, well, I don't believe in God, but when I consider the Big Bang, the Kalam cosmological argument, sometimes I wonder. You'll find that too, but more frequently, I've heard the aesthetic arguments actually reach into disbelief. A third reason in our culture right now why I believe we need to appeal to beauty is the outrage and escalation. Many people reject Christianity not because they think it is true or untrue, but because they think it is not good. They think that it is against gay people. They think that it is against those who have a disability. They think that it is against the social issues that they care about. They think that it does not have a concern for peace. They think that it promotes violence, all of these things. Now, I believe there are good answers to these concerns, but I'm just saying those are the concerns for a lot of people. And I remember it was actually Ken Samples. I was talking with Ken Samples. I referenced this conversation in the book that, 20 years ago on college campuses, the biggest objections were more about the truthfulness of Christianity, like, does God exist, etc. And today there are more questions about whether the church is tolerant and questions like this about the goodness of Christianity. Beauty can help us strike into those concerns at their deepest level. So all of that is to say, I think an apologetic that is sensitive to beauty, that says the gospel of Jesus Christ is compellingly true, but it is also the most enchanting story you could possibly imagine. It's also the most beautiful narrative that you could ever construct. Not just that is true, the most beautiful one you ever could dream of. So that we're making the appeal. The Christian story is not just more plausible than naturalism. It's just a better story. I mean, naturalism is a terrible story. It's boring. It has no plot structure. Christianity is enchanting. And I think it's helpful to help people to feel that and to see that. A second quality of apologetics that I think is helpful in our time is narrative. I think it is helpful to situate the gospel in narrative terms and to do apologetics by situating the gospel in narrative terms. Now, there's a whole movement about this called narrative apologetics. Alistair McGrath, for instance, has a very interesting book on this topic. And in my book, I go through a number of reasons why I think there can be some advantage to presenting the gospel in terms of narrative. Now, I want to clarify differently than McGrath a bit. When I say that, I don't mean just using stories to tell the gospel, though that may be involved. I mean presenting the gospel as a story, or we might say the story. And so this is what I'm doing in the book. I take 4 classical arguments and I cast them as the 4 essential ingredients to any good story. So the cosmological argument I speak of as the author of the story or the origins of the story. The teleological argument, the argument from design, I speak about as the meaning of a story, because every story has a meaning that the author imputes to it. The moral argument I speak of as the drama of the story, or the conflict, good versus evil. All stories are about good versus evil. And the Christological argument, the argument from Jesus, I situate as the hope or denouement of the story, or the happy ending. And so I'm saying these classical arguments, I use the classical argument, but then I'm trying to say these arguments are a way of telling a story about reality. And I think there's many reasons why this can be helpful. One of them is that it seems to be the case that story is how human beings most fundamentally make sense of the world. In the book, I quote a famous quote that says, "There have been great societies that did not use the wheel, but there have never been societies that did not tell stories." And that's really true. Story is fundamental to human nature. In our culture, stories often take the form of movies. Movies are very big in our culture. And stories are ways we kind of make sense of reality and impute meaning to reality. And many Christians, like Dorothy Sayers, for example, have argued that telling stories is a part of our being made in God's image. That this is one of the ingredients to being in the image of God. We tend to tell stories to make sense of reality. So an appeal to story will hit people at a level that's deeper and more holistic. It will hit people at a level that's beyond just appealing to, it's less piecemeal. If we give people arguments, they might situate those arguments in a bigger narrative. But if we give people a narrative, they've got to sort of come to terms with it one way or the other. And I just think story is a powerful way to make a more holistic appeal to people. I also think a side benefit is that narrative apologetics is better positioned to deal with the single greatest objection to our faith, and that is the problem of evil. I think someone once said there's no theodicy without eschatology. Theodicy meaning explaining or justifying the ways of God, responding to the problem of evil. Eschatology meaning the end times or the final things. And so what they were saying is there's really no ultimate, final, and satisfying answer to the problem of evil without looking at the end of the story. And I think that's something that's helpful to remember in responding to the problem of evil. It will caution us in our approach. I could say a lot more about that, but I want to keep it moving here. Let me mention my third characteristic of apologetics that I think is very helpful right now in our culture, and that's using abductive arguments. Now, again, I really want to belabor the point. This is not how everyone has to do it. There's a million different ways to do apologetics based upon a million different people out there. There's, you may be living on the street and your neighbor to your right, a hard cosmological argument is going to be best suited for them. And the neighbor on your left, a soft moral argument is going to be best suited for them. And the neighbor across the street, they don't need any arguments at all. They just need you to mow their lawn or something. So it's not, there's no one right way to do apologetics because people are different. But one way to do it that may have some particular value right now is using abductive arguments. So abduction is a distinct form of logical inference from deduction or induction. It's less ambitious, it's more modest. Deduction starts with premises and goes to a certain conclusion. Induction starts with premises and goes to a probable conclusion. Abduction works in the opposite direction. It starts with a present set of conditions and infers to the most plausible explanation. It does not give you certainty. So abductive reasoning would be like, I woke up in the morning and I looked out the window and my driveway is soaking wet. Probably rained, but it's not certain. Somebody could have washed their car there or something like this. So it's saying, look, this is the best way to make sense. It's the most plausible way to explain things, but we're not trying to jam it down your throat. We're going to give you some rope to say, and I actually like to do this, depending on who I'm talking to. I often like to do this to say, okay, to my non-Christian friend, here's my argument. If you'd like to evade it, here's how you can do so. If you don't want to accept the conclusion, here's your escape hatch out the back door. I like to give them that ability. For one thing, it takes the pressure off of us. We don't have to absolutely tighten every screw. For another thing, it can put the person in a less defensive posture. Now, again, this may not be equally useful for everyone. If you're in a public debate, maybe you do need to tighten the screws more. But in a lot of our conversations, we don't actually need to get the other person to certainty. Probability is good enough for a lot of people. The Holy Spirit can use probability. I've seen many people come to Christ, not because they were 100% certain Jesus rose from the dead, but because they thought he probably did. And then they're praying and they're, and the existential can take over at that point. So probability is good. Probability is not to be denigrated as useless. Probability can really help people. So, and it's easier. It's less ambitious. So I like this and it's sort of more rhetorically inviting a little bit, So I like to make abductive arguments. So in the book, I'm saying, okay, it looks like the universe has a beginning. There's a couple of ways you could try to construe it such that you'd avoid a beginning. But the best view is that it had a beginning. What's the best way to make sense of that? Well, a cause is a lot better way to make sense of it than sheer mysteriousness. That's cosmological argument done abductively. Teleological. It looks a lot like our universe is exquisitely well ordered and fine-tuned, and the physical constants of our universe look like they're set to this infinitesimal precision. The dial was set just right on all these factors. But yeah, we could live in a multiverse and just happen to be in the right universe. But what's more likely? What's the most elegant and simple and reasonable and most plausible way to explain things? With the moral argument, with the argument from math, argument from music, argument from love, the other arguments I make, I'm trying to say, look, here's how we experience life. Love seems transcendent and it seems significant. On naturalism, here's how you explain that. On Christian theism, here's how you explain that. Which is better? Which is the one you can actually come to terms with and live with, So that's a way to make abductive arguments. So with that said, let me transition to conclude with some examples, and we'll work through some sort of, well, let's work through the four arguments that I make in the book, and I'll just sort of take these considerations that I've put on the table, beauty, narrative, abduction, and try it on for size. Let's see how it works with these particular different arguments. So with regard to the cosmological argument for God's existence, and I'm assuming just a bit of familiarity with these arguments, so forgive me, but just to at least define it, this is the argument for God as the first cause of the universe. And there's many different cosmological arguments. This is one of the chief arguments for God historically and among contemporary philosophers. And it has been powerfully furthered by advances in the 20th century. Many of you are scientists or have scientific training and can tell us all about this. And I canvass it a bit in the book. But what I want to reflect upon for a moment is what happens if you try to wield the cosmological argument with a sensitivity to beauty as well. And what I wager in the book, what I propose in the book, is that you end up with a vision of the universe where positing a cause is not just more plausible, but it also is more expansive and more elegant. It opens up the possibilities. It's less confining. And I just teased this out a great bit, but one way to think of it is it enhances reality. Reality is hugely enlarged if there's something beyond nature. The possibility of a supernature, the way I put it in the book is like, here's the metaphor I use. Suppose that you've been living in the basement all your life. You've never heard of such things as trees and waterfalls and stars and flowers. You've been living in a dusty basement. And then all of a sudden you break through one of the walls and realize, oh my goodness, there's more out there than just this basement. And you look and there's stairs, and you look up the stairs and you see there's a light streaming through under the little between the door and the floor, that little gap. There's a light streaming through. Now, how do you feel in that moment? You think of how your whole universe has just been enlarged, potentially infinitely. Anything could be up there. You think of the thrill of discovery in that moment. Well, so I propose, should the cosmological argument be for our imagination. Think about it. If there's eternity, if there's resurrection, if there's an eternal soul that is in each of us, as opposed to just naturalism, it's no less exciting. And so I try to tease that out in the chat. So in other words, I'm trying to labor this point that it's more reasonable to believe in a cause to the universe, but it's also way more fun. It's also way more exciting. It's also way more interesting. It gives you more options, And one of the ways I do that is by reflecting a little bit on Albert Einstein and his religious views. He had a very interesting perspective. He was not a believer in God, a personal God. He was also not a hardened militant atheist in the Richard Dawkins variety. And Walter Isaacson, who's a very famous contemporary biographer, written biographies of people like Ben Franklin and many others, wrote a fascinating and well-written biography of Einstein. And he has a chapter on Einstein's religion, and he just talks about how Einstein had this sense of the mystical, this sense of the transcendent, this sense. Einstein's perspective is, if you push into physical reality as far as you possibly can, you hit something mysterious. You hit a wall and you can't go any further. And there's this intangible something beyond it that you can't quite get to. And he had this sort of mystical, you could call him like a mystical agnostic or something like this. And I want to read an anecdote from the biography. It's really interesting. One evening in Berlin, Einstein and his wife were at a dinner party when a guest expressed a belief in astrology. Einstein ridiculed the notion as pure superstition. Another guest stepped in and similarly disparaged religion. Belief in God, he insisted, was likewise a superstition. At this, the host tried to silence him by invoking the fact that even Einstein harbored religious beliefs. It isn't possible, the skeptical guest said, turning to Einstein to ask if he was, in fact, religious. Yes, you can call it that, Einstein replied calmly. Try and penetrate with our limited means the secrets of nature, and you will find that behind all the discernible laws and connections, there remains something subtle, intangible, and inexplicable. Veneration for this force, beyond anything we can comprehend, is my religion. Later on in his life, in an interview, he said, he was asked if he was an atheist, and he said, I'm not an atheist. The problem involved is too vast for our limited minds. And he uses the image of a child in a library, unable to read the books of the library. And the imagery is like, the child senses there's some meaning to this all that I can't access. And Einstein is saying that's like our universe. And I would say a theologian can agree with Einstein very much about our smallness in relation to the question of God. But we just go one step further to say the librarian is around and he can come down to our level and help us out through what we call revelation, whether in scripture or in the incarnation. And so, but that's not an overturning of Einstein's basic sense of this deep meaning beyond our ability to fully access. And I just find that way of Einstein's way of thinking, there's something we can't quite, this is engendered by cosmological arguments because it's gesturing to something beyond the physical, cause of the physical. It's helpful to draw that out, I think. With regard to what is perhaps maybe along with the cosmological argument and the moral argument, the next most popular argument, the teleological argument, or the argument for God from design, a sensitivity to beauty, narrative, and abduction, I think can help us. One of the things I think we can do is, while still making the appeal for the design of the universe as such, also touch upon specific aspects of our world and see them in terms of meaning and design. And so in the book, I talk about music, math, and love. And I'm trying to make the appeal abductively. What's the best way to understand these phenomena as we encounter them? Now, look, I will say that I'm very skeptical of overly ambitious, rhetorically charged ways of doing apologetics. I have an allergic reaction against triumphalism. I don't like acting like, haha, we've backed you into a corner, this way of doing it. I don't like that. So I'm very cautious to employ arguments over ambitiously. And I was skeptical that a good argument for the existence of God could possibly be made from music or math. But as I got into the literature on this, what turned me was not just seeing Christian apologists that I respect make these arguments. It was seeing the top philosophers of music and math going on and on about the fundamental mysteriousness of the subject matter. So you get into the argument for math. I appeal to three things about math: its permanence, its beauty, and its usefulness. So I'm saying, what's the best way to understand those? And I'm saying naturalism really doesn't give you the tools to explain that very well. Take the permanence of math, for example. Physical reality. If physical reality is all there is, where would math get its permanence? Most human beings are what are called mathematical realists. That is to say, we believe that mathematical truth is true irrespective of a human mind thinking it's true. 2 + 3 = 5, whether or not we are here to know it. It just does. 2 + 3 just equals 5. Okay, on naturalism, where does it get that permanence? The thought experiment I use is, suppose the entire physical universe were to collapse into non-existence. Would 2 + 3 still equal 5? What would there be to ensure that it equals 5? And the crystalline, neat perfection and seeming stability of mathematical truths is hard to explain on naturalism. It's so different than naturalism because physical reality is in constant flux and constant change. And I draw out that argument at a much greater level in the book. But that's the kind of appeal that I think will touch people's imaginations and experiences, especially upper level mathematicians. They often will talk about the sense of the transcendent and the sense of the beautiful that you experience in math. It really is. I mean, I go through testimony after testimony of these top level mathematicians talking about it using metaphors like, mathematics as discovery, as this exciting discovery. It's like this invisible world, and it works. It all fits together harmoniously. Why does it work so well? Why does math work so consistently? Why does it apply to physical reality with such consistency and precision? One mathematician, the metaphor is mathematical truth is like, when we do math, we're like archaeologists discovering, not architects building. And I talk a lot about Roger Penrose, famous mathematician, who talks about, he found this mathematical theorem called the Mandelbrot set, and he just says, it's just there. We just stumbled upon it. We didn't make it. So then the question comes, if there are mental truths like math that are permanent, what makes them permanent, And Christian theism has an answer for that, namely the mind of God. Naturalism doesn't. Again, I don't wield the argument to say, therefore, God must exist. Abductively, I'm saying Christian theism is a better fit as an explanatory framework for math than naturalism. And there's other options besides those two, of course. I acknowledge there's other things besides Christianity and naturalism. Similarly, I make an argument for music in the book. The way this argument basically turns is like this. Human beings generally have an experience of the transcendent through the arts. One example of which being music. And I talk a lot about Charles Taylor and his historical sketch of how the experience of the arts has changed in the context of secularization, but how there's this sense of impoverishment. And I quote an agnostic named Julian Barnes, who talks about missing God, and the context in which he misses God is in enjoyment of music, because he realizes the ultimate transcendent referent of many of these classical songs has been stripped away. And I still feel those feelings, but they don't refer to anything. But the argument, so it observes that there's this experience of transcendence through music. And then it asks, what's the best way to explain that? Well, on naturalism, that experience is explained reductively by evolution. Reductively meaning exhaustively. There's nothing other than evolutionary factors that create that feeling of transcendence. But it's a tricky one because music, the enjoyment of music, doesn't have any obvious survival value. So one of the big questions in this whole field is, well, why did we evolve to love music? And people are basically saying it's what we call a spandrel, or something that's an unintentional byproduct of the evolutionary process. So, for example, one of the theories is we evolved to develop pattern recognition because pattern recognition does have survival value. Music involves pattern recognition subconsciously, and therefore our brains get a dopamine hit as we're recognizing the patterns in music. That's one of the secular theories of why we evolved. And there's all kinds of others out there that I talk about in the book. The music mirrors speech. So we respond to music and the way we respond to a speaker, that kind of thing. That's one of the ideas. So, but the thing is, all of these ideas at the end of the day are incredibly impoverishing for our experience of music because they all result in the idea that our enjoyment of music is an accident. We could have evolved such that music would be nothing more than white noise to us. There's nothing about it other than it helped our animal ancestors survive. So it's essentially tricking our brain. There is no transcendence that it conveys. It's just triggering factors in our brains that helped our animal ancestors survive. That's it, nothing more. And most people, when they encounter that, realize that is difficult to embrace and actually, like, while you're enjoying music. You have this sense like Julian Barnes of missing God, like it's impoverishing to your experience. And I contrast that and I say, well, okay, a Christian way of explaining the sense of transcendence. And the other thing I talk about a lot is all the philosophers of music are puzzling about musical meaning. Music has this ability to convey the transcendent in a way that people really, the philosophers really struggle to understand why. Because music conveys meaning in a non-representational manner. It's different from language. Language works representationally. A word refers to something else. Music can communicate meaning without any, it can bypass your brain. It's fascinating to study the impact of music upon those who have Alzheimer's or those who are in a coma. Music, one of the philosophers says music bypasses our brains and moves straight through our molecules. Music has this powerful, mysterious ability to communicate meaning. Music can make you, a song can come across as either triumphant or sad, but not because it uses any language whatsoever. So everyone's wondering, where does it get this? And I say, well, in a Christian metaphysic, that's the classical Christian way of thinking. Music was the means by which God made the world. And you have in Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, this idea of the angels singing the stars into being at creation, drawn from the verse in Job that says, where were you when the angels were singing at creation? And this is what J.R.R. Tolkien fictionalized in the Silmarillion. The creation account in The Lord of the Rings is basically the angels using music. And it says, the music goes out into the void, and it was not void. Reality is produced by music in Tolkien's Christian metaphysic. And that's the exact same with the magician's nephew in the Chronicles of Narnia, where Aslan sings the world into being. So what you have here is two fundamentally different ways of explaining music. On the one hand, the transcendence of music is a trick or an illusion. It's taking you further away from reality. That's naturalism. On the other hand, the transcendence of music is the creator of reality. It really is a language. It's telling us about the glory of God. And so I use the metaphor. On naturalism, the transcendent joy of music is like an opiate. You enjoy it because it dulls you from what reality is really like, what's really happening around you. On Christian theism, the transcendence of music is like a window to an imprisoned man. You enjoy it because it's a little glimmer that there may be more out there. And that's how I love to think of music, a little whisper of heaven, a little whisper, there's something more beyond this world. That's what I think of when I listen to my favorite classical music. So the point is, what I'm attempting to say now is that a sensitivity to beauty and narrative and these other factors can encourage us as we make various kinds of appeals about the meaning or design of the world. In addition to kind of classical straight, I mean, I believe in all the classical arguments too. This is all just in addition. Well, I'll be very brief in my last two examples. With respect to the moral argument, I draw attention to the way movies take the same moral shape. Every single movie you ever watch is telling you the same story over and over and over and over and over. Good is fighting evil. Evil is winning for a long time. Then finally good wins. That is every movie you've ever seen. And then there are some exceptions where the good guys don't win in the end. And I talk about one particular movie, The Gray, with Liam Neeson. Good movie, 2011-ish, 2012. It doesn't and I don't want to give any spoilers, so I'll simply say it is helpful to engage for those who question whether all movies really have a happy ending. But and not every movie does, but when they don't, we feel it. And so the question is, why do we long for a happy ending? Why is it so unsatisfying when a movie doesn't have a happy ending? I mean, think what happened, and come to think of it, why are all the movies we tell, and not just movies, literature and the arts, why are we constantly framing things in terms of a moral struggle between good and evil? Why is that so instinctive to the human heart that we constantly, relentlessly tell stories that have a moral dimension? Well, guess what? On naturalism, it's just another trick. The sense of good fighting evil just helped animals survive. But there is no ultimate good ontologically. Goodness is not independent of human beings and our imaginations. It's not fixed and stable and objective. On Christian theism, it is. And to extend the classical moral argument with sensitivity to beauty, we can say that it can help us envision a happy ending. I mean, how much better news is it to believe in Christian theism than naturalism with respect to our longing for a happy ending? There's no happy ending in naturalism. There's nothing that means anything. It's not headed anywhere. The story is just random. Randomness is what we're all involved in. But Christian theism, it has meaning and it's going somewhere. It has an end goal. I submit that the difference between those is so decisive, that the human heart is so geared for the one rather than the other, that if we truly see them, we can't endure the despair that comes with the former. And we must embrace, even inconsistently, the meaning and hope that comes with the latter. With respect to the argument, I give an argument for Jesus's resurrection, and then I also give a Lord, liar, or lunatic argument, Lewis's trilemma, though I change it to a quadrilemma. But then when extending it out into the realm of beauty, the argument that I make is that Jesus's resurrection is the happiest news possible, and that it means that it has a particular, and I'll finish with this, then we'll do Q&A. The resurrection of Christ is a very particular kind of afterlife, because you could believe in an afterlife in which everything was bland and mediocre. You know, that's not naturalism. You could believe in something that's neither heaven nor hell. You know, like theoretically, you could believe that there's another world, and so you're not a naturalist or an atheist. You could believe in God, but you could believe that the afterlife is just kind of neutral. You know, so it's like right down the middle, neither happy nor sad, just kind of. Or you could believe in an afterlife in which it was happy, but and sadness was just ended. What I'm arguing is the Christian idea of resurrection is better than even that. The Christian idea of resurrection is every evil, terrible thing that has ever happened will somehow be spun towards good. And the reason, well, believe me, I don't say that without some fear and trembling right now. The problem of evil is a real problem, but I say it because I think the worst evil that's ever happened, the crucifixion of the Son of God, was turned to good in the resurrection. So here's how I put it in the book, and I'll leave you with this as a thought experiment. Because I'm quoting from the Lord of the Rings, where Gandalf says, everything sad is going to come untrue. And I'm saying that's the Christian hope. And naturalism is nothing like that. And then I say, so as a thought experiment, think back on the happiest moment of your life. Perhaps an idyllic childhood memory when the world was safe and calm. Perhaps being truly known by another person and for the first time loved rather than rejected. Perhaps the attainment of a dream or reconciliation with a friend, or a simple moment of contentment out in nature. Happiness often sneaks in quiet moments like that. Now imagine, just for the sake of supposal, that you knew in your deepest heart of hearts that you would have that feeling of happiness back permanently. That, in fact, it was only ever in anticipation or foreshadowing of that final settled happiness that you will experience forever with ever-increasing awareness and enjoyment. In other words, imagine that your happiest moments are not gone from you once they are over. Instead, they will return to you in some deeper yet all familiar form. If you knew that this was ahead of you, how would it change you? Can you even imagine the indestructibleness of the hope it would inspire? Now think of the alternative. On naturalism, there's no hope for life beyond this realm, for naturalism is just the philosophy that this realm is simply all there is. Thus, reality is headed toward a simple extinction, not a happy ending. Consider how such a philosophy will equip you to function in the face of the pain of this world. Imagine, for instance, sitting with a child with a terminal illness in a hospital room. They have just a few minutes to live. Such a worldview is completely bereft of hope to offer this child. Operating from within the parameters of naturalism, what could you even say in such a circumstance? The difference between these alternatives is stark indeed. The stakes couldn't be higher. And what I'm hoping to impress upon the reader in such comments is, even if they're not convinced, hopefully we've got their attention. And hopefully they're going to say, I'd like to know whether this is true or not, because that makes a big difference. So I'll conclude my comments there. Thanks for letting me run through that. And I'm happy to do some question and answer now.
Thank you very much. There are a couple of questions in the chat room, and I think I'm going to let them ask them themselves. Tom Kennedy, if you're still here, would you ask your question directly? I think I know. I don't actually know the answers, so you better.
Yeah, it was sort of a simple question. You mentioned at sort of toward the beginning of your talk somebody who was the great theologian of beauty, and I just didn't catch the name.
Yes, thank you very much, Tom. The name was Hans Urs von Balthasar. Just to make it complicated, right? 4 words. First word Hans, H-A-N-S. Then Urs, U-R-S. And then a lowercase V-O-N, and then Balthazar, Balthasar, Balthazar. I'll type it out in the chat here so everyone sees.
Okay, I don't feel bad for not catching that the first time through.
And then Cosmo Smith asked a question. Cosmo, are you there?
Yeah, I can.
Can you go ahead and ask your question, or would you rather I paraphrased it for you?
I'll go.
Good.
When you're talking about Einstein and the way that he mentions pushing into the physical realm as far as possible and sensing something, like why or how did he get that sense? Was it just because of the ordered nature of the universe that he saw, or something else?
Yes. Yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah, it appears to be related to a sense of the order and intricacy of the universe. So, for example, once another thing that I mentioned is a little girl asked Einstein if scientists pray. And he's answering and he says, everyone who's seriously involved in the pursuit of science becomes convinced that a spirit is manifest in the laws of the universe, a spirit vastly superior to that of man, and one in the face of which we with our modest powers must feel humble. So there he's referencing the laws. And in other contexts, he speaks of this, the discernible laws and connections. So I think the idea is that he's perceiving through physical study, the study of the physical realm, that there are connections and laws that are consistent and harmonious. He would often do these thought experiments of imagining, if I were God, how would I create the world in his pursuit of trying to make breakthroughs? And it seems to be this sense of the harmony, consistency, and order of these laws that gave him that feeling. That's my read of him.
Next question comes from Dirk Meyer. He's got his hand raised, I see. So Dirk, you're going to need to unmute yourself to ask your question.
Hey, Gavin, this is Derek. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead. Thank you.
What you were describing about mathematics kind of reminds me of an argument that I heard some time ago, and it goes basically like this. So the mathematical argument for the reasonableness of God's existence. So I guess premise A would be, if God does not exist, the applicability of mathematics is just a happy coincidence.
Mm-hmm.
But the applicability of mathematics is not just a happy coincidence. And then, therefore, God exists. Does that pretty much sound like a summary of what you were saying?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It would be a summary of the third wing of the argument. I appealed to three features of math in the book. I really just briefly canvassed this just now in my comments, but first, it's permanence and durability. Second, it's beauty and elegance. And third, it's usefulness and applicability. And that third wing is the most common argument for God from math. It is made by William Lane Craig. It was popularized by a philosopher named Eugene Wigner in 1960, and that had an enormous impact, his article. He's basically saying there's no way to explain why math maps onto physical reality so neatly. So that third wing is the most common argument for God for math. And I draw attention to that, but I also find it helpful to appeal to some other features of math as well as its applicability, its permanence and beauty specifically. But the applicability is really true. It's like objects and ideas fit together. And on naturalism, why? It's just a coincidence, you know? And for theism, it makes sense because the same mind is behind both.
There's a question. Sorry, there's a question that I've never heard anyone really address regarding math, and that is, why is it that so many and virtually all equations involving division, for example, or powers come out to an even power, like division of something to the 1 power divided by the something by the 1 power, or something to the 1 power divided by something to the 2 power, or something to the 1 power divided by the 3 power. Is there any logical reason for this, or is that just another example of beauty?
I don't know enough about math to comment on this specific example.
Okay,
You know,
perfect.
the thing that I start off the book saying is I hated math when I was going to school. So it's so funny that I'm not, but now I'm interested in the philosophy of math, which is a little different. But
Okay.
what I can say is, in general, there are many examples like this where
Okay.
you'd say it seems so consistent in ways that are just curious from a naturalistic perspective.
Okay, all right. I'm going to start alternating here now. I see that we've got a hand raised, but there's also a question that was raised in the chat room, and that was, first one was by Kim Hansen. So Kim Hansen instead of Kirby Hansen. Kim Hansen, would you unmute yourself and ask your question, or would you rather I did it?
And I unmuted. So I heard your comments about transcendence and experiencing that through beauty and music. And would you say that is how we seek God, our experience of God? And is that the same way Jesus experienced God?
That's an interesting question. If anyone would like to chase this down a bit in terms of what is the meaning of this word transcendence, that's something that is disputed and worked through right now, because a lot of people say that what we mean by transcendence has changed in a secular context. And if people want to check out Jeremy Begbie's book, Redeeming Transcendence in the Arts, 2018 book, fantastic, fascinating book. He's saying that in a secular context, transcendence has been untethered from its traditional meaning, because traditionally it has to do with God's otherness and God's uncontainability, that God is completely different from us and we can't contain him. So transcendence is this kind of upper realm, you know, that is so different and alien to us. But in a secular context, there's nothing quite like that. So the concept of transcendence itself is kind of mysterious in a secular context. What we as Christians mean typically is this classical conception of God's supreme lordship and otherness that is reflected to us in various ways. So yes, we experience a sense of the transcendent in connection to God, our worship of him and various things he has made, like the huge stars, you know, and music and the arts, for example. So, and certainly, you know, the part about Jesus, I think what we might be helpful for us to say there is that Jesus himself is the pinnacle means by which God has communicated his nature to us, his revelation to us. And so we experience God's transcendence most centrally there in the incarnation of Christ.
Okay, we're going to do this now. The next thing I want to do is ask Ron Martin to unmute himself and ask the question that he's got. And then we've got a couple of hands raised, first Ray Uzel and then John Wu. So we'll start with Ron Martin first. Ron, go ahead. Unmute yourself.
I have heard secularists and naturalists say that they can think more clearly than Christians because their reasoning isn't confused by beliefs about things that we can't verify or something like that. But I heard someone say that we Christians actually are the only clear thinkers because there's something about reasoning that requires or is benefited by a belief in God. I don't remember. I'd like to be filled in on if that's true and what it is.
Yes, thanks for that question, Ron. And absolutely, this is one of the very common arguments for the existence of God. It's called the argument for God from reason. And Alvin Plantinga is a contemporary philosopher who's a huge proponent of it. Another sort of specialist on this argument for anyone interested is Victor Repair, or I don't know how to pronounce his name. It's Reppert. It looks like Reppert, Victor Reppert or Repair. But he wrote a book called C.S. Lewis's Dangerous Idea in Defense of the Argument from Reason. This is a common argument C.S. Lewis made as well. Here is how it is expressed by himself, a skeptic. If my mental processes are determined wholly by the motions of atoms in my brain, I have no reason to suppose that my beliefs are true, and hence I have no reason for supposing my brain to be composed of atoms. That's kind of a one popular, but the idea is, if the evolutionary factors are the reductive account of everything about us, then yeah, it does reduce our confidence in our ability to reason our way to truth, because our brains are fundamentally geared for survival, not necessarily for truth. And I think that is a powerful appeal that can be made. And the alternative Christian way of looking at reason has often seen reason connected with the image of God, so that reason does have an ability to engage with truth, and it is one avenue by which we experience transcendence and by which we can relate to God. And so, yeah, that's a powerful appeal that many top philosophers from Lewis to Plantinga make.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Ray Uzel, go ahead.
First, I absolutely love your approach. And part of the reason is it's very consistent with the thinking of a person I think is one of the most important thinkers alive today, a gentleman by the name of Ian McGilchrist. Are you familiar with his work at all?
I've heard the name, but I can't say I know much about him.
Okay. Basically, he's a neuroscientist, and he pushes the idea that there's a important difference between how the left hemisphere and the right hemispheres of our brains process information. It's so important that every mammal on Earth has a split hemisphere. Every bird has a split. I mean, it's very, very important. And it has to do with the way we pay attention to things and how we process information that we pay attention to. And what you're saying, and his theory is that most of the big problems we have in our society, say for the last couple hundred years, is because it's been a decided shift towards left hemisphere processing. And he says what we really need is to have a balanced approach. Both are useful, and basically everything you said appeals to right hemisphere kind of attention and right hemisphere kind of thinking. So I think it's perfectly in line with everything McGilchrist says. By the way, his two big books, big meaning 1,400 or 1,600 pages. The most recent one is called The Matter with Things. And basically left hemisphere is very thing oriented. And that's the way he expressed it with the title. But you might want to, he's a kindred spirit to everything you're talking about, really.
Thanks so much for mentioning that. You know, just a quick comment in consistency with what Ray was just saying. It's interesting, this appeal to truth and beauty, to the head and the heart, it does seem consistent with just normal human operations when we're functioning in a healthy way. Think of the way we fall in love, you know, it's not irrational. It's not irrational to fall in love, but it's not just reasoning. You don't just calculate, you know, or think of the way you trust your friends, or think of the way you find your calling in life. Most of the deepest things of life aren't strictly rational. And so it seems consistently with this comment about right and left hemisphere, and with the general functioning of human beings, that our apologetic would be holistic like this as well.
Go ahead, John. What's your question? Unmute yourself. Thank you.
Hey, howdy there. Yeah, my comment was actually just right in line with what Ray was mentioning, what you, Gavin, what you were just talking about. There's so much of in our everyday experience, right? Everything, you know, isn't reducible to a major and minor premise, right? It's not something we can prove with absolute certainty with through a syllogism. And so, yeah, I really love this approach. It really, like you guys have mentioned, it really deals with the entire person, and again, other facets that we deal with in everyday life. That's not necessarily captured in some forms of apologetics. So,
Thanks, John.
Let's see. Kirk, you have a comment about Eugene Wigner and some interesting ways to find out more about him in Wikipedia. Did you want to say anything more about that online?
Yeah, we're still here. We're about to run out on the town, but yeah, Wigner is well known among physicists. He was a Nobel laureate, and he was. I just looked him up to make sure he was a Nobel laureate. He was actually the thesis advisor to John Bardeen, who discovered. I think he got 2 Nobel Prizes, if I remember right. But anyway, Wigner is highly respected. He's secular. I don't think he was a theist, but it puzzled him why mathematics worked so well to describe the physical universe. And he published a paper that almost every physicist knows about, the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in the physical sciences or natural sciences. And it kind of puzzled him. Why does something theoretical like mathematics describe reality so well? And so I think, as Gavin was saying, that's a good argument to make. And he's a well-respected guy, not a theist, not a Christian. And he kind of opens that argument up for us.
Thanks for mentioning that, Kirk. And if I'd like to make a comment on that, if I could, just in agreement with Kirk's comment there about, Wigner's, the Wikipedia page, people can read to see his argument, but this general idea that many of the leading intellectual figures on many of these questions are not Christians, and yet are gesturing towards the reasonableness of a theistic account. That's what I found with the philosophers of music and math. That's what you find with Paul Davies, who's an agnostic physicist that I quote a lot and is often quoted a lot in relation to design arguments, because he's basically saying, I don't believe in God, but our universe looks designed. And there's other figures like that. And I think there's a danger we could have, from my vantage point, of using these quotes in a triumphalistic way to say like, well, Paul Davies said this, therefore it's true, or something like this. We want to be careful because sometimes people do that. They take the quote from the agnostic philosopher out of context to make it sound like they're a believer. And we want to be careful to not misrepresent them or wield a particular quote in an overly aggressive way. But what I think can be helpful is to help people see the more reasonable agnostics and atheists, a Paul Davies, a Eugene Wigner, others, as the best representatives of that tradition, rather than the more aggressive, rhetorically charged, more angry atheists, the new atheists who have no respect, and I just find that helpful for people to see them as the best representatives of that tradition, because then it helps the discussion be less charged and more calm, because there's less contempt for religion from this more reasonable strand of agnostics.
Okay, Randy Lewening has got a chat comment there. Randy, can you turn that into a question, or can you at least bring it up anyway? Bring up the quote that you're talking about from Romans.
You bet. Yeah, I think one of the parts of Romans that I love and that actually aligns with sort of the idea of having creator and creation both bring truth is in Romans chapter 1. And so just the verses that I quote there basically make an argument that as we acknowledge the glory of God, our ability to discern truth from error is enhanced, and also to discern good from evil. And as we reject God, the opposite occurs. And so to me, that's sort of an argument that's very much in line with what we've been discussing this evening.
Gavin, do you have any comment on that?
No, other than just thanks for the comment. Yeah, that it's insightful comment, and my only reaction to it is it's just what hits me as I recall this passage and the truth there that Randy was saying is just how sobering that is. for all of us to gulp and take very seriously the rejection of God, or in any, even as Christians, it's easy to hold God at bay in some area of our lives, and it's sobering to remember when we do that, it sort of warps the image of God in us in some way to a degree, and it has an effect. And it's kind of a basic truth there, but that's very sobering to think about.
I don't see any more questions being raised here. So, but we don't want to let you get away that easy. So I'm gonna throw a softball at you, I guess, and talk about my own personal experience. My wife and I listen to music every morning, and it's generally classical music. And as she can well attest, every once in a while there's something that really gets to me and makes me feel weepy inside. It's not. I think it's exactly what you're talking about, but I can't explain it. It's not, there's no rational reason why I should feel this way. But, and why should I, for example, why should I get emotional about Rachmaninoff's music when Rachmaninoff was not even a believer, and yet he could write this marvelous stuff that just really speaks to my heart.
Mm. Yeah, it is definitely the case that the music that we experience that communicates transcendence is not necessarily from Christians. Much historic classical music has been. You think of Handel's Messiah, there's a lot of classical music that's thoroughly, explicitly Christian. By the way, there was a great quote at the beginning of this from Derek, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. And it's apparently from a Bavarian monastery. It says, quote, "Beethoven gave us God's fire. Mozart gave us God's laughter. God gave us music that we might pray without words." Whew. That gets at some of the issues we've been talking about the communication of the transcendent through music. But yeah, so the argument is not, though, from just Christian music. It's just from music. And if we have a robust doctrine of common grace, we can appreciate that all music, secular music, it could be a secular classical musician or whatever that is used, because just as, in so many areas of life, it doesn't need to be a Christian who built this microphone that I'm using, that's common grace. That's not saving grace that produces that skill and that mechanism. And we could say about so many other things. Now, the interesting question is, what about different forms of music? Do all forms of music communicate transcendence, or is it just classical? And that's an interesting question that the philosophers get into a bit. And some have argued that certain expressions of music communicate transcendence more than others. And then others want to say, well, they all communicate transcendence, but just differently. And then you get into questions of what is music, exactly what are the parameters. And so that's kind of where some of the philosophers ask those kinds of questions, but maybe a bit too much for us to tackle all that tonight.
One more question before we let you go. There was a letter to the editor in the Wall Street Journal the other day bemoaning the awful circumstances in Uvalde, Texas, and wondering how a good God could allow that to happen to all those innocent children. So I wonder if you would comment on the thoughts there.
As a father with 4 children and a 5th on the way, the eldest of which are in elementary school, my instinct and my response is to be very slow to try to give answers, but first to just express my immense shock, sorrow, outrage, and grief at such a terrible thing. I can't fathom what the parents are going through, and the siblings and others. It's just heartbreaking. So I don't approach a question on such a serious matter with triumphalist answers. I approach it, first of all, with tears and sympathy for the suffering. Now, if the conversation continues and a person really needs some answers. I think there are some ways that Christians can help us along to struggle to understand that that our whatever else our response is, it shouldn't be a rejection of the existence of God. And I think one of the reasons for that is if we do that, that creates the problem to be worse. I really do believe that. I think the problem of evil is a problem for everyone. If you don't believe in God, you lose the ability to call it evil in a robust sense, and you lose any sense of ultimate hope in relation to it. Now, I'm not saying that completely answers the problem. I'm just saying this is a problem no matter what you believe, you know. I would say that while it can sound like cold comfort, and I'm kind of even hesitant to go there is the defense that we can give that we live in a fallen world. We live in a world where creatures have misused their freedom, and therefore evil happens, and God allows that evil, but he is not morally responsible for it. The agents misusing their will are those who are morally responsible for it. But if we ask, well, why doesn't God intervene? You know, the two appeals that I personally come back to at the end of the day are, first, I do believe that God is working for a greater good through evil in some way, mysteriously, that we can't comprehend. But secondly, and more emphatically, I believe that God is trustworthy for many reasons, but ultimately because of Jesus, a God who subjects himself to the worst of human suffering, the worst pain that's anyone's ever gotten through, and the cross. Unfathomable blackness and suffering. A God who takes that unwillingly out of love is a God that we can trust. And so, but I would end with what I said earlier: no theodicy without eschatology. And that means I think we can only fully land, fully, and close the circle fully to see all things at the end of the story.
Well, thank you very much, Gavin, for spending so much time with us and giving us so many good things to think about. I'm going to ask you to close this meeting with a word of prayer. Would you please do that?
I would be happy to do that. And let me express my thanks to all of you for the privilege of being with you all. And I pray the Lord's blessing on you. And I pray that your chapter continues to grow and flourish. And may the Lord bless you. So let me pray. Gracious Heavenly Father, thank you from the bottom of our hearts for being so good and so real that each time we think about these different topics, we can encounter some new aspect of your glory, your goodness, your love. I pray for each one of my friends who's on this meeting tonight, that you would bless them, that you would give them wisdom as they're interacting with others around them that do not know you. They would have gracious words seasoned with salt that commend who you are in a meaningful and compelling way. Lord, we know there are so many people right now in despair and darkness. We pray for a mighty outpouring of your Holy Spirit to bring revival and renewal and a fresh awakening to the gospel. And we pray that you would use us to that end, and we give ourselves to that fully. And we thank you for Jesus and what he accomplished for us on the cross. We pray in his mighty name. Amen.
Amen.